Thanks and welcome everybody to this very important platform. My name is Chuma, and I'm going to be our moderator for today. This is another of ICRW's insights platform. It's a very important platform that we set up for sharing critical evidence and informed action on major social issues. Today we'll be discussing just in terms of elaboration on who I am. I am the Director for Global Health, Youth and Development at ICRC. We'll be discussing a very important issue today, sex-trafficked children and the evolving landscape, the legal landscape. I think we focus on the US. And we've got as we speak, about 60 persons online. So it's a very highly subscribed event for today. And we also have 3 speakers in the room. We have Kate Price. Kate Price is a PhD student in sociology, and the winner of ICRW's Miriam K. Chamberlain Institutional Award. So we're happy to have you here. And the second person we have in the room is Christy Reno. Christy Reno is the Senior Director of Policy at Shared Hope International. Hope I got it right? You're welcome, Christy. And very finally, is Professor Keith Bentele. I specifically asked for the pronunciation of that name. We are very happy to have you here, Dr. Bentele. He is a professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts. So we have about 20-30 minutes for the presentation, and after that we'll open it up for discussion. And I know we're going to figure out a way of taking questions and responses from those who are online. So without further waste of time, I want to invite Kate Price to come and take over this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really want to thank ICRW. Receiving this award in the fall was just amazing. It was what I usually get. I'm not attached whatsoever to funding or awards or anything, but it was like this one, I really wanted it. And so I was grateful because I am very much, my passion is gender-based research. And I do know that, I believe that the Wellesley Centers for Women, Layleen Mopayan, the executive director, her executive assistant, Christy Camp, is live streaming right now. So I'm so grateful. So I'm just grateful to Sarah, to Julia, to Christine, to Kristen, to Joe, everyone here. It's been really amazing. I'm also briefly, so I'm going to do a brief introduction to the work, and then Christine is going to speak, and then I will speak about the current, preliminary findings, and then Keith Bensley, who is actually my dissertation advisor and who has become a great friend, will also, and then he will speak about his larger work in terms of what state legislation looks like in other areas. He really focuses on abortion, abortion restriction state policy, as well as income equality. And so looking at this legislation within the larger landscape of what state legislation looks like in the United States. So that's what I'm very grateful to have both of them here, because I would not be able to do my research without them. Primarily, Shared Hope International is really the only anti-trafficking organization who is very much tracking state by state child sex trafficking legislation, particularly around decriminalization. And so my work is directly linked to, if they didn't do what they did, I would not have data, literally. So, or it would take, they have a team of 3 doing it, it would take me that much more. So first what I just want to do is a very brief introduction about where we're at right now with state legislation. And in terms of decriminalizing, particularly child sex trafficking victims. And by decriminalization today, I mean states that will neither arrest nor prosecute kids for prostitution. I also want to be very clear in noting that my definition is a little bit different than Christine's, and she'll speak to that a little bit. So our maps are going to look a little different in terms of one or two states, not dramatically. But I just want to be clear on that our definitions are a little bit different. So as you will see right now, the green states are states that neither arrest nor prosecute sex trafficked minors. There are currently 14 states that will neither arrest nor prosecute. The orange states that are states that will arrest but will not prosecute sex trafficked minors, and all the remaining states fully decriminalize, arrest, and prosecute sex trafficked minors. And so I think a lot of times people are shocked to find out that there's 31 states in the United States that will both arrest and prosecute kids. There are 36 states that criminalize kids for prostitution on some level. And the primary reason, and it's mostly prosecutors, and I'll talk about this a little bit more once I get into my preliminary findings, but the primary reason that states do want to arrest and prosecute kids is they want to use it as leverage. They use it when they're identifying a child who is being trafficked. They want to be able to say to the child, you need to go get services, you need to go with me, or else you need to get help from social services, or we're going to arrest you, we're going to throw you in jail. And so they literally, quote from one prosecutor is, yes, it's a great tool in order to be able to control kids. And so for me, in my advocacy, I'm here today as a researcher, but as an advocate, that makes me insane because that is not trauma informed. And at the same time, that is also very much where we're at. On the flip side of that, one thing I have really learned from decriminalization advocates in my current research is that some decriminalization advocates, quote unquote, understand that because there are so few resources, there are so few services for kids. Therefore, prosecutors, social service organizations, legislators are nervous that, okay, if we fully decriminalize this and then a child ends up dying or something like that, it's like that we have the kids completely fall through the cracks. So anyway, I'm getting into my current research a little bit more, but so just to give you an introduction on this. So CSEC is the commercial sexual exploitation of children. So under the federal law, the TVPA states that all kids, anyone under 18 is automatically a child sex trafficking victim. That is not true within the states. Crime policy is a state issue due to its federalism, that mostly federal does not deal with crime. It's also, so we're talking about non-compliant kids are being criminalized. And so that's what prosecutors are saying, well, if they're being non-compliant, which to me, as in my advocacy role, I read as a child is triggered, is having a traumatic response, which research shows often happens if you're being arrested, if you're in terms of being in a jail cell, and that kids are being non-compliant, they're being out of control. And there's a whole host on that in terms of what that looks like in terms of gender bias, that, being out of control is not feminine, being out of control for children of color looks very different, or in terms of trusting police looks very different than white children. So that's, I will not go into that, but that's a whole nother issue. The other piece is that, so what happened within state legislation created legislation called safe harbor that was created in terms of the state decriminalizing. The other thing, I just need to take a deep breath and say, I'm so triggered doing this. I don't know if people read this in my bio. I'm a survivor of child sex trafficking, so of family controlled child sex trafficking. And education and doing this research is literally the thing that propelled me through all of this. So the fact that I'm actually standing here presenting my research as a PhD candidate is a little overwhelming. And I do a lot of public speaking, and I never, ever get nervous. But today, right now, I am so triggered. And so it's like there are 10,000 different things going on in my brain. And I'm very grateful that both Christine and Keith are here because I've been working with them both now for 3-4 years, so, and the ICRW organization has been amazing. So, yeah. there's a lot happening right now. Even though I'm standing up here with a clicker, there's a lot happening. So anyway, okay. So safe harbor. I'll go back to this now. This is where I am grateful that I have done a lot of public speaking, and it's just like, it's all good. No one's gonna die. Like, no. So safe harbor was one legislative tool that New York created in 2007 as a way to say, okay, so kids are criminalized on the state level, but they're not criminalized on the federal. So they created this law called safe harbor. But that actually doesn't automatically equal decriminalization. The data will show that it is more likely the state will decriminalize, but that's not the case. Like, for instance, Massachusetts, where I'm from, we have safe harbor, but they will, kids can be arrested and prosecuted in Massachusetts. Go into this a little bit, but not too much. Keith and I actually published an article in the William and Mary Journal of Women in the Law in 2016. It's called Voting to End Vulnerability. And what we did was, using shared hope data, looked at comprehensive child sex trafficking legislation. And these are the findings. This is what we found in terms of states that, when we talk about time trend, it was just over time, states are passing these laws with increasing vigor. There was a safe harbor, more state legislators who were Republicans, as well as identified as female, white evangelicals, which I did as a proxy for faith-based organizations, the presence of a statewide human trafficking task force, and then there was an interaction effect, which basically means, well, Keith's going to go into that a little bit more, but so it's like if a state did not have a task force but had more NGOs, such as anti-trafficking NGOs, they were more likely to have, or they had more comprehensive child sex trafficking legislation. But that was looking at everything. So this is a graph of how Shared Hope, their scores, and this is what Shared Hope does, a report card, and gives states a numerical, more comprehensive legislation that they have, the higher their score. So this is what was changing over time. And Keith is also going to go into this a little bit more. We also broke down in terms of criminal provisions as well as protective provisions. So states with more Republican legislators were more likely to really focus on the criminal provisions for traffickers and for buyers, whereas states with in terms of protective provisions of decriminalizing, had more female legislators, more anti-trafficking NGOs, more faith-based organizations. So that's how things really broke down. Oh, I apologize to say, if people wouldn't mind, I know you're all quite busy, but in terms of texting or any photography or anything, that's also really triggering for me. Technology was a big part of my trafficking experience, so computers are fine, so if you're taking notes or anything, but just to be really mindful of that. So sorry I didn't say anything. But what happened when we were looking at that, the comprehensive legislation, or the comprehensive scores of legislation, really became very clear to me that, oh my gosh, so many states do not decriminalize. So that's what I really focused on for my dissertation. So that's what I'm looking at. This is my research question, is what factors explain legislative decisions to decriminalize versus criminalize commercially sexually exploited children between states. I'm doing a mixed methods. So I'm doing interviews with at least 30 decriminalization advocates, state legislators, legislative aides, and state prosecutors. And then I'm also doing a statistical analysis examining the social, political, and economic factors that significantly associated with the states being more likely to pass decriminalization state legislation. And for me, it's important to do mixed methods because the statistical methods say one thing, but then to actually to give these things context and to being able to do, the interviews. So now I will pass it over to Christine, and she can speak, and then I will come back and talk a little bit more about the preliminary findings.
Okay, thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate the opportunity to ICRW for having me here today. It's been so nice to meet Dave and really sort of see this opportunity for our research, which we're doing for advocacy purposes, to also be used for research, which will then inform advocacy. So it's a great collaboration, and I'm really excited to be here today. I just want to give a little bit of background on Shared Hope, just to explain how we got to focus on this issue. Shared Hope International, we have our roots internationally. We have Villages of Hope in India, Nepal, Jamaica, where we provide services to sex trafficking victims, or through our partners. However, our research back in 2006, we started under a Department of State grant, started doing research on the sex trafficking markets in 4 countries, and one of those countries was the United States. And as a result of looking at the United States and realizing the scope of the problem here, not really expecting that scope to be what it was, we really saw the need to continue to do more research on the issue of sex trafficking in the United States. With that, in 2009, we did research specifically on domestic minor sex trafficking in the United States, and that was in our National Report on Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking. Flowing out of that really was our Protected Innocence Challenge. We saw that we have a strong federal law, and as Kate talked about, there's a strong federal law that protects all child sex trafficking victims and identifies any commercially sexually exploited child as victim of trafficking. But that was not, and we started, so the Protected Innocence Challenge started in 2011. And in 2011, not every state even had a trafficking law. It took just until a couple of years ago, we had the last couple states actually close this gap. And we also still have a couple of states that require forced fraud or coercion for a child to be recognized as a sex trafficking victim, even though the vast majority of other states and the federal government say it doesn't matter if a child was forced, if a child was exploited through commercial sex, they're a victim of trafficking. So really the development of the Protected Innocence Challenge framework grew out of what we learned from that research. And it really is just a couple of things that are good to think about. What we do with the Protected Innocence Challenge is we analyze all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And if you really want to dig into your state's laws, we have about a 50 to 60 page analysis report. We also have a 2-page report card, which is a little bit shorter read. And the report card also has a grade. And the grade in doing this analysis has allowed us to really sort of call the states to action, to say, here's a way to improve. This is a tool to look at what are the gaps in the laws, and also to celebrate progress too, because that's also part of what we're doing. And so with this analysis, we're looking at all of the states. We want to see every state get to an A, because we want to see every state have that minimum fabric of legal protections for child sex trafficking victims. The other thing is that the Protected Innocence Challenge framework is just looking at the statutory analysis. We're just looking at the laws. We're not actually grading on the implementation of those laws. We're not grading on the enforcement of those laws. That doesn't mean we do also, though, recognize the importance of the implementation and enforcement. And in particular, because we are a victim advocacy organization, and we're really also particularly looking at how are states implementing laws that have actually, that either mitigate or remove criminal liability for child sex trafficking victims. And so over the years, this is kind of our first report really looking at this. We started our Just Response project to specifically look at related access to services. And Just Response is really a way for us to bring together the questions of what comes up when we're implementing laws that provide access to services, which a critical part of is actually removing criminal liability. And so how do we bring that together with what's happening with state laws? And one of the ways that we've done that is actually we convened our Just Response Council. And our Just Response Council is a group of over 30 experts on juvenile sex trafficking. And they advise and convene and meet and really dig into some of those complex policy issues that are not possible to examine in a report card or even the state reports where we're just looking at the statutory analysis, but really look at how is this implementation impacting what we're doing with our state laws. And so when we take a look at the development of the state laws, one of the reasons we saw the need to really look at implementation is we have seen a lot of progress. You can see the darker states are the lower grades. The lighter the color is the higher grade. So we look at 2011 to 2017, you can see the map really lightening up. We went from, in 2011, we had no states with an A, and more than half the states were failing. By 2017, now in 2017, we have more than 30 states with A's and B's, and we have no more failing states. So it's really been substantial progress in the 7 years that we've been doing this, and we're currently working on our ACE report. What's interesting though, and then you can see too, as a national average, we went from failing from a national perspective to a B. We still have work to do. And the other thing is that states have really approached this differently. We've seen states improve by leaps and bounds. Kansas and Montana going up 4 grades. Other states really have not. Kate mentioned New York, which was that was the very first safe harbor law in 2007, and yet New York really hasn't progressed on this. And there are a number of challenges, and so we're kind of taking a look at that. And one of the things that we're finding is that as we're looking at the progress in states, also Illinois, I just want to point out to Illinois and Vermont, are also 2 of the early states to remove criminal liability for minors. And yet, in a number of other ways, have not really advanced their laws since we started creating in 2011. And so this allows us to kind of look at where are the states going? And I think what we're finding really tracks with what Kate is finding, in the sense that these are the areas of law. The 41 component framework that we use to analyze the states breaks down into 6 areas of law. Some of them are larger than others. 2 largest are demand and protective provisions for child victims. And that actually, protective provisions for child victims is the largest part of the framework. And it's really where we've actually encountered the most difficulty with moving states forward. That's where most of the gaps that we're seeing are remaining at the state level. And part of this is that we're really getting into issues that are more difficult. They're also requiring more resources. They're requiring more than just a law. They're requiring also probably a law and an implementation and coming back and saying, okay, what do we do next? It's not one law at a time. It's a process. It's a long-term process. And in particular, that really applies when we're talking about non-criminalization of child sex trafficking victims. This is just, it's a challenging issue for every state. And so as a result, I think really one of the reasons, I think this kind of goes back to what Kay was talking about, we're looking at an issue that people have an understanding of trafficking, but that is very different than understanding why children shouldn't be criminalized for sex trafficking, child sex trafficking victims shouldn't be criminalized for their own victimization, for the same conduct that makes them a trafficking victim. And so one of it kind of comes back to trauma. And so this slide kind of looks at what's above the water. This is what are the law enforcement officers, even child welfare caseworkers, this is what people are seeing, the rebellion, defiance, the anger, these outward actions that have been non-compliant victims. What they're not seeing without an understanding of trafficking and trauma and how trauma influences behavior. They're not seeing how the trauma is influencing guilt and shame and isolation, fear of being retaliated, the retaliation from a trafficker, and just feeling really, truly frightened. These are the things that when we're criminalizing kids, we're doing more harm because we're not addressing what's happening under what we see. And really what we also find is that the most negatively impacted victims are often the most vulnerable. We're talking about kids who run away in homeless youth. This is something that has been a challenge, despite the clarity in federal law about any child who's bought or sold for sex as a child sex trafficking victim. Runaway homeless youth who are in a situation of needing to exchanging sex acts to survive are often not seen as trafficking victims. And yet they're being exploited, and really vulnerable young people being exploited because of that vulnerability, but yet aren't seen as trafficking victims. And another issue is that trauma bonding and the influence of trauma, again, recognizing young people are not going to, and one thing with this slide is the help slide. You're not going to see that. You're not going to see a request for help or even likely cooperation. So really kind of getting past these ideas is really challenging at the, and it's a big part of what we're seeing that we need to do with our advocacy at the state level is educating. process and making sure the legislators understand what we're talking about here. So to do that, we actually have a new campaign that is Stop the Injustice, which is really specifically focused on ending the criminalization of child sex trafficking victims. We have actually been advocating for this change in state laws since 2011. But we've sort of advocated for states, all the states, to really move their laws ahead. Now that we've really seen a lot of progress in general across the board, and a lot of progress, especially on the criminalization side, that's where we've seen the most progress. This needs to be a focus because it affects everything else we're doing. And oops, here we go. And as Kate mentioned, we have a couple different states, but we are looking at, so this map is looking at, there are 27, the dark states are the 27 states that criminalize child sex trafficking victims for the crime of prostitution. There are 2 states on here that kind of fall in the middle. They actually have removed criminal liability for minors under 16. So they still criminalize older minors. And this is in conflict with their own trafficking laws, which actually would identify a commercially sexually exploited child who's 16 or 17 as trafficking. And yet they're drawing the line in another place. And largely this is not understanding how these two go together. One of the things that I want to kind of just run through is the reality is that it's challenging. And why is there so much lack of understanding? We want to kind of take a quick look. I just want to run through what are the reasons that we have so much difficulty moving these laws ahead. And so some of the things that he mentioned, the district attorneys want to be able to have a tool to be able to say, okay, well, if you don't testify against your trafficker or you don't participate in services, it's a way to coerce either services or to participate in prosecution. And yet we've actually heard from some prosecutors that building rapport and getting access to services has actually resulted in better prosecutions because they have better victim witnesses. And then there's the issue of the trauma that's involved when you have a child who is criminalized for their own victimization. Child welfare and child serving agencies are already overburdened, and this is something that we also understand, and often lack training. And this, again, despite there are some federal laws that are addressing this, but it will take time. This is a shift in terms of child welfare serving this population. But again, there are some emerging approaches. This doesn't mean we throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we can't serve these kids because child welfare isn't ready to do this. We're seeing child welfare agencies reallocating resources, having dedicated staff, and then also collaboration with NGOs. And there are NGOs really providing specialized services that are able to, we're seeing kind of collaborative multidisciplinary efforts in states so that it's not just child welfare responding, but it's a multi-agency. Seeing Coalition, for example, in Massachusetts, 40 entities under an MOU. So, law enforcement agencies may be opposed because arresting the child is a way to keep them safe. And if local judges agree, then they're making placement decisions when a child comes into the court. The thing is that, well, how are we defining safety? Is a child in a detention center safer? They're going to, what we're doing is we're sending a message that basically reaffirms the trafficker's narrative, which is no one's going to look out for you, and then they prove that when we detain a child. And when they get out of detention, just as likely to go back to that trafficker. Advocates, also, we've heard from advocates, we need to have funded access to services. On one level, we want every state to have this goalpost for removing criminal liability, but we don't, and services are a challenge, and it doesn't, passing a law that simply removes criminal liability is not the solution, but it actually has, we've seen some states have found creative ways to use this to push the need for services and to push the issue of services forward and to create urgency for the services. We've seen in Tennessee, and sort of a couple of examples that I won't go into detail because I'm probably over time. But there really are, actually the mapping report that I mentioned at the beginning is really kind of goes into some of the implementation it just shows how we can learn so much from the implementation. Just this is a long-term process. So.
This is definitely a long-term process, and as Christine was talking, it's just like there are about 6 different talks within this. There are so many different things happening. The other thing I realized I failed to mention in the beginning was that why does this matter? Why does it matter to look at states? It's like so many people are just like, well, often the response is, well, they're fine. They're federal, they're fine, they're not victims. Like then we'll just be identified as victims and we'll move on. However, state law enforcement, our state level first responders are usually the first people who are coming into contact with kids. You know, so that's why it really, really, really matters. And again, that really goes back to our federalist system. And that's what I'm loving looking at Christine's, like so many things that she's talking about are absolutely, they're spinning so well, things that we're finding, because we've talked about the data together, but not all of these other outside issues in terms of state prosecutors, in terms of resources and services, but that's exactly what the data are showing. So that's why, to me, that's always exciting, that when the numbers really do, complement the narrative. So first I'm going to talk about the statistical analysis, and first I want to be very clear that these are very much preliminary findings. I will not even be defending my dissertation until next spring. And so actually having this presentation has been wonderful in terms of really being able to pull together preliminary findings, finding some really big mistakes that I made with the data that I cut out quick, to fix. But it's actually been a very good thing. It's been a very good thing. So statistically, the main things that we found in terms of states that are more likely to decriminalize or how they're responding, the significant factors, and this is the statistical models, they're controlling for the time trend, for policy diffusion or regional diffusion, which means that if a state neighboring states have decriminalization, so controlling for that, as well as the number of juveniles sentenced to death or life without parole prior to the Supreme Court rulings, in terms of those stating that those 2 sentences were unconstitutional. So I created a variable for that with as a proxy of how does a state think about criminalizing children in general. So that's what I was controlling for all of those. So once again, in terms of states more likely to decriminalize or less likely, the time trend, just like the previous analysis, the passage of time is a really important factor. It's probably the most important factor, and that's actually speaks to the theoretical framework that I'm using for my dissertation is called punctuated equilibrium theory. We saw this very much happen with same-sex marriage. So there was very much level, not much happening in terms of state legislation on that, and then all of a sudden a big jump over time, and then you plateau out again. I hypothesized that we're in the middle of that in terms of child sex trafficking legislation. In 2016 alone, was it 6 states or 8 states passed non-prosecution? They would arrest or not, but the big jumps. But to the other end of that, in this last year, in 2017, was it 8 states? 12 states. But in 12 states introduced decriminalization legislation. None of it passed. I was part of the Massachusetts. We didn't even get out of Judiciary Committee. So, but there's a lot of activity happening now. So for me, it's like it even gives me chills. Like this is the perfect time to be studying this. So what a great opportunity. So that time trend is very important. We're really getting a snapshot of what's happening now. The presence of a safe harbor law does matter in terms of safe harbor, and this is where it's like safe harbor for every 1%. No. This is
Let's just do more likely, less likely.
Okay, more likely. Okay, great, perfect. So states that have a safe harbor law are 5 to 13 times more likely to decriminalize child sex trafficking victims. And I'll show you the actual statistical models. I'm still learning the interpretations a little bit, so I get a little bit embarrassed. And then also, this is a big one, the presence of a statewide human trafficking task force. Same thing, the presence of a task force, depending on the model, the presence of a task force, states with a task force are 8 to 110 times more likely to pass decriminalization. And I'll show you in the models, 110, it's in states that have, if they don't have a human trafficking task force, but more NGOs that don't have, anyway, he's gonna talk about that a little bit more later too. States that have the number of GOP state legislators. So for every 1% increase in the number of GOP legislators, states are actually 4% less likely to decriminalize. So while this is not a partisan issue, they're 4% less. The other thing I really want to stress when I'm telling you these numbers of 4 to 110, this is such a rare event. It's almost like a 1 in a million happening. So it's like the number of the more or less likely are very small relative to the actual chance that it's going to occur, that it will be occurring. Yes, we want it to happen, but it is not happening that often. The number of white evangelicals, again, that I use as a proxy for faith-based organizations, they are 1% more likely to decriminalize. And the big one was actually in terms of the per capita people living in areas of concentrated disadvantage, which we're really talking about poverty, state economic conditions such as unemployment, and the number of children, are the higher number of people living, per capita people living in areas of concentrated disadvantage. They're actually 96% less likely to pass decriminalization. And for me, including state per capita concentrated disadvantage was really important for me to put in this model, because in the first models that we did, I looked at the percentage of kids in poverty. You know that poor kids, I grew up as a poor kid. That's why I grew up in Appalachia. I was a poor kid. I was white trash. I was disposable. It very much goes on with the narrative of what white trash is in this country. That is like, that's just what's supposed to happen. Like that was a big part of how my trafficking even happened. That's what those families do to one another. That's what white trash families in Appalachia do to one another. So the percent of kids in poverty did not come out as significant in the first models that Keith and I did in terms of the overall comprehensive child sex trafficking legislation numbers, the shared hope report cards. And I was like, no, there's more, there's something going on there. So it was really important for me to include concentrated disadvantage. And so I'm not surprised, sadly, that states with more people living in areas of concentrated disadvantage are actually less likely to decriminalize. So then the other thing, that these are the things that are not significant. So policy diffusion in terms of regional policy diffusion, it doesn't matter if you have more states around you. We do have a cluster of states in the Midwest that have decriminalized, but that is not a larger significant factor. State budget considerations, that does not matter. The reasoning for including that was thinking that there is, in Keith's research, he's found that, and larger state policy research, there are states that have more resources are more likely to pass more progressive legislation. That was not the case in these models. The number of women state legislators, not significant. Number of the Christian right is very similar to the white evangelical, using that in terms of faith-based organization. The number of calls to the National Trafficking Hotline, the Polaris Project, as well as the Uniform Crime Report, prostitution arrests, I use those as proxies to prevalence. So in states that have more sex trafficking reports of going on, that also does not matter. The juvenile sentence to life or death without parole prior to the Supreme Court rulings, and the number of children in foster care. That was in terms of, because there are so many kids. I know that in Massachusetts, one of the most amazing organizations that work with sex trafficking victims, My Life, My Choice. I'm very lucky to work very closely with them for a number of years, that about 65% of the population that they serve are DCF involved, Department of Children and Families, and I have seen statistics as much as 85% of sex trafficking victims have been involved with the foster care system. So all of these things, these were not significant, which to me even says like, that's significant, but they're not significant in terms of how our states responded to this, because we just don't know, we don't know what are those factors. So, and then again, this is what Keith's going to talk about this a little bit more, but in terms of NGOs and the present, basically the big thing with this is task forces matter. The presence of a statewide human trafficking task force, they have a lot of power. They really do move things forward. And so Keith's going to talk about this a little bit more, but in terms of NGOs, the presence of incarcerated African-American juveniles and the presence of incarcerated girls. So that matters. So these are the actual models. I won't go into them, whatsoever, but I think, yeah, you were on a couple. But in terms of, I did 6 different models in terms of looking at the significant factors in various ways. And so the one thing I really want to put it like this one is 110 times more likely to pass decriminalization is when we're looking at states that with task force and NGOs, but those things matter, and it really looking at the models in different contexts of things. So I'm happy to share people who, but the most part, it might look like a lot of like, oh my gosh, what does this mean? So the final thing I want to say is I still do have 3 variables that I'm creating over the summer. So the presence of child sex trafficking survivor testimony to see whether or not that matters. State prosecutor statements publicly supporting state level criminalization. Right now, my current models do not have any sort of proxy for state prosecutors. And we're really, though they are really the main opposition. And that I found, that's one of the things that I love actually, that Shared Hope found that separately from me, that it's like all of these things really, it's going a lot, very, very textbook in terms of political science theory. This is shaping up that way. And then the final thing is the presence of earmarked state budget spending for child sex trafficking services. That is, I'm hearing that very much in my interviews, that is very important. So wanting to do those tests. And then the qualitative, and this is the final thing I will say, the qualitative interviews, what I'm hearing, I've done 13, I'm doing at least 30, hope to do 40. But the biggest thing I walked away with that is people talking about the importance of child sex trafficking survivor perspectives, and that we really need to have survivor voices in the middle of all of this is the biggest thing, as well as this covers a lot of what Christine was talking about, the importance of state budget money, as well as the reason for criminalizing and controlling kids. And this is actually very interesting. Therapeutic coercion is the term that sociologist Forrest Stewart has created in terms of when police officers, law enforcement, criminal justice agents are talking about using criminalization as a way to help, as a way for services. Therapeutic coercion is what he talks about. I think that really sums up what we're seeing very nicely. So, okay.
Okay, so I just want to begin by saying I'm not a subject matter expert on child sex trafficking legislation, although I'm learning an enormous amount from Kate. So Kate asked me to speak to broader dynamics that shape state level policy outcomes. Most of my research is on looking at either the consequences of state level policy decisions or why certain types of policies are more likely to pass or not in certain states. So these are a couple of the elements that I look to first for trying to understand state level policy outcomes, and the anti-sex legislation is very different than a lot of the other policy areas that I've studied. And so I'm going to speak to some of that and kind of ask some questions to Kate as we go through. So speaking about stakeholders, so in different policy areas, there are very, very different constellations of stakeholders that are involved in those conversations. And the reason why this matters is that the type of analytical lens that you use to understand those outcomes is very different depending on the relevant stakeholders. So in a simple example, if we're talking about minimum wage, you have business lobbies, business communities, and a wide range of allies that will push against minimum wage increases, and then you have unions, labor activists, and these other organizations. So the relative strength of these organizations in terms of resources, their mobilization capacity, obviously will affect outcomes, right? And this is a point in an undergrad lecture where I talk about how incredibly obvious this is, and we're not learning anything profound right now. But this is a basic thing to pay attention to. And what's interesting in terms of anti-sex legislation is that the community of stakeholders that are involved in this conversation, I think, are very small relative to other issue areas. And part of the consequence of that, one, is that the narrative about why a bill passes in any state might be very idiosyncratic. It might be a single survivor testifying, having a very powerful impact. It also means that statistical analysis might not be the best way to look at this phenomenon, and that's part of why having a mixed method approach is really important, because those qualitative stories about how this actually happened can be very informative in a way that sometimes a statistical approach may not be. Other issue areas like abortion restrictions, you also have these very wide coalitions of pro and anti forces, but you don't have this economic component, right? You don't have the business community involved. This is more about very strongly held ideological beliefs and mobilization that are bringing people to the table. Similarly, anti-CSEC legislation, you have very strong advocates on one side of the issue, but the sort of anti-decriminalization side is, again, I think relatively small, right? It looks like it's prosecutors and some members of law enforcement. I don't think they have advocacy organizations necessarily operating in the same way. And so the way in which these sides are matched against each other, again, I think is a little bit unique in this case. Okay, so that has to do with sort of stakeholder mobilization. In terms of political opportunity structure, this is, again, sort of like unnecessary jargon that we use talking about are there allies or are there political openings for advocates. And so the basic insight is that if you have receptive allies in a state government, then your advocacy will be more likely to work, right? Again, very intuitive type of theory, but it's very important for understanding why pressure actually translates into outcomes. And if you have a very unreceptive state government or unreceptive political party in control, your advocacy will often go nowhere, right, in practice. And again, in the case of anti-CSEC legislation, this is, as of now, to my mind, or my impression is that it's not a very politicized issue in terms of partisan affiliation, right? This issue is not heavily identified with either Republican or Democrat. I think that that's good in the sense that you have a wider range of targets in terms of advocacy. It can also be bad, though, in the sense that it's not strongly identified with a party that will then carry forward that policy in their party platform and in state legislatures. Okay, the other piece that is a very important part of this story is diffusion, as has been mentioned a few times. So what diffusion represents can be a lot of different things, right? Why is a policy spreading? Why is it diffusing? Is this about national advocacy organizations? Is this because a political party has picked up the issue and is now putting that on their state platforms? Or is this because there's a lot of media attention to the issue and everyone feels the need to respond? Or are states emulating each other as kind of the normative policy position on this issue changing over time? So I think this is kind of an empirical question. Hopefully that will be answered by the qualitative interviews in terms of what has been the most important mechanism for the spread of these laws. And I'm sure probably organizations like Share Hope will be a part of that story. The last thing I want to mention is that one of the things that has popped out in my research repeatedly, and is also interestingly emerging in Kate's research, is this idea of what some people call institutionalization of policy goals. So one really strong example of this is that anti-abortion or pro-life evangelical advocates have been very aggressive in terms of literally entering state Republican parties and putting very, very strong anti-abortion positions on party platforms. This is something that just a couple decades ago was not the case, and it has rapidly proliferated and translated into the massive passing of dozens and dozens of abortion restrictions at the state level. So it's a way of taking sort of advocacy goals or movement goals and institutionalizing them into a party platform, and that's a very effective mechanism for policy change. Another one that I think is very interesting to think about is the creation of new organizations that advocate for particular types of policy change. And I just want to say as a side note for advocates that this seems to be very effective. So faith-based initiatives, which I've done a lot of research with a couple colleagues, the creation of state-level faith-based offices has been like a massively effective vehicle for getting state legislatures to adopt a whole wide range of faith-based initiative legislation. In the case of anti-CSEC legislation, the presence of anti-trafficking task forces at the state level also appear to be have a very, very strong influence on the subsequent likelihood of the passage of both CSEC legislation in general, but also decriminalization specifically. So again, it's sort of this outsourcing of movement goals to a part of the government that is now acting on behalf of your issue. The last thing I'll mention is champions are often very important, especially the clearest example is that in the case of anti-abortion legislation, there's a number of situations where you'll have these states that just have this incredibly high number of restrictions that have been proposed, like just dozens and dozens and dozens every year. They don't always pass, but there's a lot of activity around them. And often it's one legislator who that's they're a single issue legislator. That's what they're there to do. And they're just going to introduce bills over and over and over about that. You really have to pay attention to those dynamics because it'll really change what's happening in states, right? It's literally like not even necessarily anything about the state, it's just that you have this one person who's a really strong advocate, and that can create these really different numbers in terms of activity. So I think those are things to pay attention to, and I think Kate's research is speaking to a lot of these issues, and I just want to re-emphasize this issue about the task forces as being sort of a strong and clear finding that's coming up from their research. So I'm finished. Thank you.
Thanks very much. This is why this platform is called Cite. So we're going to open it up for discussions and questions. I don't know if we've got people online who have questions, but we can start with the room. Yeah. I've got one or two, but I would defer to the room. Okay, so we'll take a couple of questions and then allow the presenters to do the questions.
Okay, this is my book, which I'll pass around. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Lori Handrahan. I just want to preface this that it's very traumatic and very difficult for me to come to these talks. So people will be kind to me because a lot of people aren't often, and that's what makes trauma worse. And I came because of you, because I saw that you're a survivor. So I guess I have an explanation that I'd like to share and then a point of interest. So my daughter was raped by her father at the age of 2 in the state of Maine. Child protection worked very closely with the judge and the cops to keep her in his custody. He's a criminal alien who was on the list to be deported. ICE tried to deport him. Somebody protected him. I hadn't seen her since she was 4. She'll be 13 in November. So I am prepared for the likelihood that she will run and end up on the street. He got sole custody of his second child at the age of 2 as well. He mail ordered a bride from Serbia after I divorced him. I had been regional gender advisor for the UN in the Balkans when I met him, and he's from former Yugoslavia. He has a long record of domestic violence, assault, and fraud, and shoplifting. I have a PhD from the London School of Economics and Gender. I've dedicated my life to sexual gender-based violence in war zones, Darfur, Chad, South Sudan. None of the feminist women, liberal, progressive groups that I've been a part of my whole life have helped me. Child protection has been actively involved in Maine, which I know very well, in trafficking children. Former law enforcement, federal law enforcement will say in presentations that I go to that it's widely known that foster care has been infiltrated by pedophiles. So one of the things that I found frustrating is in most of the research that I've seen on human trafficking, there's this complete de-link between child pornography. Child pornography is human trafficking. The largest group of children are under 4 because they can't be legal witnesses in court. So, and it's fathers. And the Canadian Child Protective Organization has talked about this. Former FBI agents here in DC have said it's incest, it's child protection involved, and it's prosecutors and law enforcement. I have a list up on Medium, which I've written about in the book. I'm happy to pass out some copies. I have 110 state and local law enforcement who've been arrested for their involvement in child sex trafficking, judges who've been arrested for child sex trafficking, federal law enforcement. So when you wonder why prosecutors and law enforcement are coming out against this, it's to their advantage to criminalize that child because they can use that to maintain their trafficking of children. I can tell you in the state of Maine, it's the police, it's the prosecutors, it's the law enforcement, the judges, and I can't get anybody to help me investigate this ring or save my daughter or even help me. They've taken everything from me. I had 2 homes on the ocean in Maine, $500,000. I was a professor at American University. Everything's gone. I've been unemployed for 5 years. I'd be homeless. Right now, if my friends weren't paying my rent, nobody will employ me because the traffickers came after me. They stalked me, they harassed me. Federal prosecutors in DC and in law enforcement have wanted to help. They always go back to Maine. Maine says we're not touching it. A former child protection officer in Maine has come out publicly and sued the state and said they're running a ring. She was run out. I mean, this is all quite public. The head of Spotlight at Boston Globe, I talked to him, he's from Maine. He said, everybody knows this story. It's widely known that this has been going on in Maine. I can't touch the story, it's too big. So I came late because I always think, what if somebody there can help me save my daughter and I didn't go, So that's why I'm here, to just say, please buy my book, please help me, I need a job, I need a federal prosecutor, federal law enforcement, and I need people to look at, most of the traffickers are not stereotypical, and the money that's going for a lot of the trafficking is to research Black inner city pimps. It's very racist. We're not looking at the college professors, the head of departments, the presidents, the judges, the white men who are actually the ones purchasing these children. It's wealthy men who purchase children, right? And they don't do it because your career will be destroyed if you try to do that. So I guess it would be, I'm not surprised about the prosecutors and the law enforcement. And if you look at who's involved in doing this, that would be, I think, really helpful. And I'd love to talk with you afterwards and give you my book and plead to anybody who can help. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.
Can I respond to that, or do you want to? No, I appreciate your story. I'm incredibly sorry to hear what's happened to your daughter. It sounds exactly what happened to me.